If you've been cruising for more than 15 years, you've witnessed something that today's passengers will never experience. The cruise industry has quietly erased dozens of features that once made sailing feel truly magical. Some changes happened overnight after tragic incidents. Others disappeared so gradually that most people didn't even notice until they were gone forever. But veteran cruisers, they're still heartbroken about what we've lost. What I'm about to show you will make you realize just how dramatically cruising has transformed. These aren't just small changes. These are entire experiences that have vanished from the seas, and most of them are never coming back. Picture this. It's nearly midnight, and you stumble upon what looks like an art gallery that somehow ended up in the dining room. Towering ice sculptures of dolphins and ships glisten under soft lighting. Elaborate butter carvings shaped like roses and swans sit next to fruit displays that took master chefs 6 hours to arrange. The chocolate fountain centerpiece is surrounded by desserts sculpted into miniature cruise ships, complete with intricate details that make you question whether you should eat them or photograph them. This was the Midnight Buffet, and it was absolutely spectacular. Every major cruise line offered these elaborate late-night spreads well into the 2000s. The prep work started at dawn, with teams of culinary artists spending entire shifts crafting displays that would only be seen for a few hours. Ice carvers worked with chainsaws and chisels, creating massive sculptures that would slowly melt throughout the night, adding an almost poetic element to the experience. But here's what most passengers never realized about these midnight masterpieces. The cruise lines were hemorrhaging money on them. A single midnight buffet could cost upwards of $15,000 in labor and ingredients, and surveys showed that less than 20% of passengers actually attended them. The elaborate displays were photographed more than they were eaten, leading to massive food waste that became increasingly difficult to justify. The final nail in the coffin came from changing passenger demographics. Modern cruisers tend to be early risers who prefer morning excursions over late-night dining. The party until dawn cruise culture that sustained midnight buffets simply evolved into something different. By 2010, most major lines had quietly phased them out, replacing them with simple late-night snack stations that cost a fraction to operate. Today's passengers have no idea what they're missing. Those towering ice sculptures, the artistic butter displays, the chocolate fountains surrounded by edible masterpieces, all gone. But that's just the beginning of what the cruise industry has buried in its past. Every morning on Carnival and Princess ships throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, passengers would wake up to find something magical by the pool deck. Overnight, skilled ice carvers had transformed massive blocks of frozen water into stunning works of art. Eagles with outstretched wings, elaborate ships complete with rigging details, dolphins that seem to leap from their frozen pedestals, and these masterpieces appear fresh every single day. The ice sculptors were true artists, many trained in culinary schools or recruited from high-end hotels. They worked through the night while passengers slept, using chainsaws, chisels, and specialized tools to create sculptures that would slowly melt throughout the day. Watching a detailed ice eagle gradually lose its sharp features as the Caribbean sun worked its magic became part of the cruise experience itself. But here's what made these sculptures even more special. They were completely temporary art. Unlike paintings or statues that could last forever, ice sculptures had expiration dates. Passengers knew they had maybe 8 hours to appreciate the artistry before tropical heat reduced it to a puddle. This created an urgency that made people actually stop and really look, at the incredible craftsmanship. The tradition started disappearing around 2008, and the reasons were purely financial. A single ice sculptor's salary, plus the specialized tools and massive amounts of ice needed, could cost cruise lines over $200,000 per year per ship. When budget analysts calculated that most passengers barely glanced at the sculptures while rushing to breakfast, the math became impossible to justify. Cost-cutting executives argued that passengers were more interested in taking selfies with the sculptures than actually appreciating the artistry. They weren't entirely wrong, but they missed the point completely. These daily ice sculptures created a sense of wonder and anticipation. Passengers would genuinely look forward to seeing what appeared overnight, turning a simple walk to the pool into a moment of discovery. Today's cruise ships replaced ice sculptures with digital art displays and LED installations that cost less to maintain and never melt. They're technically more advanced, but they lack the soul of watching a master craftsman's work slowly return to water under the morning sun. The Instagram photos might look similar, but the experience, that magic, disappeared forever. And speaking of things that disappeared due to liability concerns, there's one cruise activity that was so thrilling and so dangerous that it's almost impossible to believe it ever existed. Yes, cruise ships once handed passengers actual firearms and encouraged them to shoot clay targets over the open ocean. Skeet shooting was a standard activity on many cruise lines through the 1980s and into the early 1990s, complete with trained instructors and dedicated shooting areas on the upper decks. Passengers would line up with shotguns, aim at clay discs launched over the water, and fire away while the ship sailed through international waters. The whole setup sounds insane by today's standards, but it made perfect sense at the time. Cruise ships were already in international waters where many firearm regulations didn't apply. The clay targets were biodegradable, so environmental concerns were minimal. And passengers absolutely loved the adrenaline rush of shooting skeet while watching the ocean horizon stretch endlessly in every direction. But the legal landscape was shifting beneath the cruise industry's feet. Maritime security regulations became increasingly strict throughout the 1990s, especially as international tensions rose. Having firearms on board, even for recreation, created a paperwork nightmare at every port. Different countries had wildly different laws about weapons, and cruise lines found themselves dealing with customs officials who weren't thrilled about guns crossing their borders. The final blow came from insurance companies. Liability coverage for firearms activities became prohibitively expensive, especially after several passengers were injured by recoil or flying shell casings. One incident involved a passenger who lost partial hearing from standing too close to another shooter. Another passenger on a different cruise suffered a shoulder injury from improper gun handling. These weren't catastrophic incidents, but they were expensive lawsuits waiting to happen. By the mid-1990s, cruise lines quietly retired their skeet shooting programs. The guns were locked away, the clay target launchers were dismantled, and those upper deck shooting areas were converted into more seating or observation decks. Today's passengers can enjoy rock climbing walls, surf simulators, and zip lines, but they'll never experience the unique thrill of firing a shotgun while sailing through the middle of the ocean. What replaced these high adrenaline activities were safer alternatives that still got hearts racing but didn't require weapons training or liability waivers. But skeet shooting wasn't the only environmentally questionable activity that cruise lines offered without a second thought. Picture standing on the stern of a cruise ship with a bucket of golf balls and a driver, taking aim at the endless expanse of ocean behind you. For decades, this was actually an organized activity. Cruise lines set up driving ranges on their back decks, complete with nets to catch wayward shots, and staff members encouraging passengers to let it rip into the sea. The balls that missed the nets, they just disappeared into the ship's wake, adding to what passengers jokingly called feeding the fish. The activity was wildly popular because it combined the satisfaction of a perfect golf swing with the unique experience of being hundreds of miles from land. Passengers loved the novelty of driving balls toward the horizon, watching them arc through salt air before splashing down in waters thousands of feet deep. Golf enthusiasts treated it like a bucket list experience. Where else could you literally drive balls into the middle of the ocean? But environmental scientists were quietly documenting a problem that cruise lines didn't want to acknowledge. Those biodegradable golf balls weren't breaking down nearly as fast as advertised. Ocean currents were carrying them to coastlines, where they washed up on beaches in alarming quantities. Marine biologists started finding golf balls in sea turtle stomachs and bird nests, creating a PR nightmare that cruise companies couldn't ignore. The real wake-up call came in the early 2000s when environmental groups began tracking exactly how many golf balls were ending up in the ocean. Conservative estimates suggested that cruise ships were dumping over 50,000 golf balls annually into marine ecosystems. Even the so-called fish food golf balls made from compressed fish meal were creating unnatural feeding patterns that disrupted local marine life. One by one, cruise lines quietly discontinued their ocean driving ranges. Some replaced them with simulator golf that used projection screens, while others simply converted the space into more seating areas. The nets came down, the golf ball buckets disappeared, and today's passengers have no idea that cruise ships once encouraged them to literally litter the ocean as a recreational activity. The environmental awakening didn't stop with golf balls, though. Cruise lines were also quietly eliminating spaces and services that had become too costly to maintain in an increasingly digital world. Walk onto any modern cruise ship and you'll find gyms, spas, casinos, and entertainment venues packed with the latest technology. But try to find a quiet library with actual books and you'll come up empty-handed. Yet, for decades, cruise ship libraries were sanctuaries of calm in the middle of the ocean. Elegant rooms lined with thousands of books, comfortable reading chairs positioned near large windows, and a peaceful atmosphere that felt worlds away from the party decks above. These weren't just token book collections either. Carnival, Princess, and Royal Caribbean maintained extensive libraries, with everything from best-selling novels to travel guides, maritime history, and even rare books about the destinations passengers were visiting. The library staff, often retired librarians who worked seasonal contracts, would host book clubs, reading hours for children, and quiet game tournaments like chess and backgammon. The reading rooms were designed as genuine escapes. Soft lighting, leather armchairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows created spaces where passengers could spend hours lost in a good book while watching the ocean roll by. These rooms had a timeless quality that made you forget you were on a floating resort packed with thousands of other passengers. But the digital revolution killed cruise ship libraries faster than almost any other traditional amenity. E-readers became mainstream around 2010, and passenger surveys showed that fewer than 5% of cruisers were using the physical libraries. Why carry heavy books when you could download hundreds of titles to a device that weighed less than a paperback? The economics became impossible to justify when those prime real estate spaces could be converted into revenue-generating venues. Carnival officially announced the removal of libraries from their ships in 2016, citing decreasing popularity and changing passenger preferences. The beautiful reading rooms were gutted and transformed into everything from additional bars to expanded gift shops. Royal Caribbean followed suit, converting most of their library spaces into internet cafes and then eventually into more specialty dining venues as Wi-Fi improved throughout their fleets. The last holdouts were some of the older, smaller cruise lines that catered to more traditional passengers. But even they eventually succumbed to the pressure to maximize profitable square footage. Today's cruise passengers can access thousands of digital books through ship Wi-Fi, but they've lost something irreplaceable: the experience of discovering an unexpected book in a peaceful, beautiful space surrounded by nothing but ocean. And speaking of physical mementos from cruising's golden age, there's one souvenir tradition that passengers absolutely loved until technology made it completely obsolete. Remember when cruise ships had dedicated photographers stationed at every major location, capturing candid shots of passengers throughout their vacation? These weren't just formal dinner photos either. Cruise photographers were everywhere, boarding the ship, at the pool, during shore excursions, even waiting at the gangway when you returned from port. By the end of your cruise, hundreds of professional photos documented your entire vacation. The photo galleries were destinations in themselves. Passengers would crowd around massive display boards, scanning through hundreds of printed photos to find shots of their family. The excitement of discovering a perfect candid photo of yourself laughing at dinner or posing with friends by the pool was part of the cruise experience. You'd mark your favorites with sticky notes and head to the photo desk to purchase expensive packages that seemed worth every penny when you were caught up in vacation euphoria. But the real treasure was the cruise recap DVD. These professionally produced videos combine footage of your specific sailing with interviews from the captain, highlights from onboard entertainment, and sweeping shots of the ship visiting each port. They captured the entire voyage in a way that personal videos never could, complete with dramatic music and professional editing that made your vacation look like a Hollywood movie. The ship-on-a-stick photo became an iconic cruise souvenir, a professional shot of passengers posed in front of a miniature model of their ship. These cheesy but beloved keepsakes were displayed proudly in homes across America, serving as conversation starters that instantly identified you as someone who cruised. The photographers had the poses down to a science, positioning families just right to create that perfect vacation memory. Then smartphones killed the entire industry overnight. Why pay $50 for a professional photo package when everyone in your family had a camera in their pocket that took better pictures than the cruise photographers? Instagram stories replaced recap DVDs, and passengers started documenting their own vacations with more authenticity and creativity than any professional crew could match. The photo galleries emptied first, then the photographers were reassigned to other duties, and finally the entire photo department disappeared from most cruise lines. Today's passengers have thousands of vacation photos stored in their phones, but they've lost the magic of stumbling across a perfectly timed professional shot they never knew was being taken. However, the most controversial change in cruise history had nothing to do with technology or safety. It was about adult freedoms that European cruise culture took for granted until American family values changed the game forever. On the uppermost decks of cruise ships throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, small signs warned passengers they were entering clothing-optional or topless sunbathing areas. These secluded deck spaces, usually tucked away behind the main pool areas, were remnants of European cruise culture, where adult passengers could sunbathe without tan lines in designated areas away from families and children. The tradition made perfect sense on ships that primarily served European passengers, where topless sunbathing at beaches and resorts was completely normal. These weren't party areas or anything salacious. They were simply quiet sun decks, where adults could relax without worrying about tan lines or feeling constrained by swimwear. The areas were clearly marked, positioned away from main traffic, and strictly enforced as adults-only spaces. But as American cruise lines expanded and began targeting families with children, these adult-only areas became liability nightmares. American passengers complained about accidentally wandering into topless areas despite clear signage. Parents worried about their teenagers stumbling across these spaces even though they were intentionally isolated from family zones. The cultural clash between European relaxation and American modesty created constant friction. The cruise lines tried compromise solutions first. They moved the topless areas to even more remote locations, added extra signage, and stationed crew members as guards. Some ships created elaborate barriers and dedicated entrance points to ensure no one could accidentally wander in. But American cruise passengers simply weren't comfortable with the concept, regardless of how well these areas were segregated.
By the late 1990s, the topless sun decks had quietly disappeared from American cruise lines. The spaces were converted into additional seating areas, expanded pools, or more family-friendly activities. European cruise lines held onto the tradition longer, but even they eventually abandoned it as the industry became increasingly globalized and family-focused.
Today's cruise ships offer adult-only areas like Serenity decks and solarium spaces, but they come with strict dress codes and conservative policies. The European cruise culture that once celebrated adult relaxation has been completely sanitized for American family sensibilities, leaving modern passengers with no idea that cruise ships once offered clothing, optional experiences, in designated adult areas. Looking back at everything that's vanished from cruise ships, a pattern emerges. The industry has systematically eliminated anything that carried liability risk, required specialized labor, or didn't photograph well for social media. We've traded the artistry of ice sculptures for LED displays, the romance of midnight buffets for efficient grab-and-go stations, and the adult sophistication of earlier cruising for family-friendly entertainment that offends no one. Modern cruise ships are undoubtedly safer, more efficient, and more profitable than their predecessors. But they've also become more sterile, more predictable, and less magical. Today's passengers get bigger ships with more amenities, but they've lost the sense of adventure and sophistication that once made cruising feel truly special. The cruise industry's transformation mirrors broader cultural shifts towards safety, environmental consciousness, and digital convenience. These changes weren't arbitrary. They were responses to real problems, genuine safety concerns, and evolving passenger preferences. But something intangible disappeared along the way. The feeling that you were embarking on a genuine adventure rather than checking into a floating resort. So next time you're on a cruise ship, take a moment to imagine what those same decks looked like 30 years ago. Picture the ice sculptures melting in the morning sun, the elaborate midnight buffets that took hours to prepare, the quiet libraries where passengers discovered unexpected books while watching the ocean roll by. Remember that cruising was once riskier, more sophisticated, and infinitely more unpredictable. The golden age of cruising is gone forever, but at least now you know exactly what we lost along the way.